You are now listening to EdYOUcate, the most fired up educational podcast there is. EdYOUcate is all about the quality education access to students and how we can provide research-based solutions to free the young minds of the world. On this podcast, we will be exploring different educational experiences, education's greatest of debates, and more. The hottest educational podcast out. EdYOUcate is brought to you from the Albany State University's very own Center for Educational Opportunity. Enjoy.
On today's episode, we will be discussing school choice, polling and surveys on K-12 education. We have a special guest today, Paul. If you would like to introduce yourself to the listeners and just give them a couple of background information about you and who you are and what you do.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here, Jamila. It's really a pleasure to be with you. I really admire all the work that the Center for Educational Opportunity does and Dr. Kathaleena Monds. I have such great respect for and the work that she does. And so I think it's a great opportunity to be here with your listeners. And so I'm with EdChoice, and we are an organization that promotes and educates and informs about school choice throughout the country. And so we're a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that promotes opportunity and options for all families in the United States. And as part of that, as part of the work, we do a lot of research. And so I head up the research team at EdChoice. And we do a lot of reporting of data and other information about private school choice programs around the country. And so we have now more than 70 private school choice programs in the states throughout the U.S. And this was a big year in 2021 for some new programs to actually be enacted. And that's just in recent developments in the last couple of months. I could go into that a little bit later. But we do a lot of reporting of the data around those school choice programs. We also do a lot of fiscal analyses and research around school choice programs and other types of K-12 education topics. And we do a lot of survey research and polling around K-12 education, school choice, and other issues that typically that families and schools deal with on a regular basis. And so we try to be, an information gatherer and provider to a lot of other nonprofit organizations and a lot of parent organizations and parent groups and other advocates around the country.
Well, thank you for that. I would like to just start off by asking the question of this common denominator of, schooling and how COVID, really shook the world unexpectedly and kind of disturbed the normalcy that we have in life in general, but definitely in education. So would you just like to speak on how schooling during the pandemic has kind of affected the work that you have done or the research that you have discovered from the pandemic on schooling, whether it's public schools or, private schools?
Sure. Yeah. So the pandemic, as we all know, and for a lot of your listeners, I'm sure, have experienced firsthand, was a tremendous shock and disruption to all of our lives and to schooling and education around the country. And so back at the beginning of 2020, EdChoice partnered with Morning Consult, who they are a data and survey research firm that has conducted a lot of market research and other kinds of polling. And so we got together and we actually started to do a monthly tracking poll before the pandemic hit. And so we started in January 2020. And we were polling nationally representative samples of the general public, of school parents, and then on a quarterly basis, we would poll a nationally representative sample of K-12 teachers. And so it just happened that we had a couple of months of tracking before the pandemic really hit and the lockdowns occurred in March 2020. And so we've been able to see over time on a monthly basis just what that level of disruption has been to families and to the public. And it certainly reached a peak. And based on our data, the peak was really in March and April of last year, where parents and the general public told us that was very disruptive to their households and personal routines, their local communities. And then there was a downward slope over the late spring, summer, into the fall last year. And then, as we all know, COVID had that second major wave hit us over the winter. And so in January and February, we saw those levels of disruption ramp up. And then it's been coming down, and people have been feeling a little bit better, at least as reported in our surveys, since February. And then it's plateaued a little bit in the last couple of months. But in terms of numbers, though, even now when it's plateaued a little bit and it's a little bit on the lower side, we still see upwards of a quarter to a third of parents in the public who are saying that the pandemic is still very disruptive to themselves, their families, their communities.
Oh, so my next question would just be to ask, you were mentioning the disturbances of the pandemic and how, it affected everyone's lives and it affected schools. And so I just wanted to ask about, school choice and the developments during the pandemic on the state level, how it also affected the development of schools, and if you could give some data on the state level activities and just, allow us to understand from a data perspective on how it has impacted education.
Sure. On the public opinion side, so we as part of our polling, we've been asking about different types of school choice policies. So school vouchers, education savings accounts, or otherwise known as ESAs, public charter schools. And we've seen that the opinion has been pretty stable. And so what we see is typically about 3 out of 4 parents express a lot of support for those types of policies, particularly for education savings accounts. And then we see upwards of 2/3 to close to 70% who would say they support charter schools and school vouchers. And that's been fairly consistent over time. And how is that translated, and how does that compare to the activity we see at the state level and in terms of policymaking? And our organization does follow and track legislation and activities at the state legislatures, and what kinds of programs are being expanded or even newly created. And we saw this year, in this first half of 2021, in this legislative session, we saw some major breakthroughs in states that never has had any school choice on the books. And so what we saw is that as far as new programs go, we saw that 7 states enacted 9 new programs. And so that's the most that we've seen in any one year that we've been tracking for more than a decade. And then we also saw another 14 states expand 21 programs. And that's also a high that we've seen over the last decade. The examples that really stand out, at West Virginia, they enacted an education savings account program. And that's nearly universal, where we estimate about 94% of the students in the entire state of West Virginia are now eligible for the Hope Scholarship Program, which is an ESA. And an ESA is really a multi-use type of program where you can use government funds for either private school tuition, tutoring, online courses. If you have students with disabilities can access therapies with these funds. And so it's really multifaceted, very flexible for families to pursue educational options and other types of learning opportunities. And so we're really excited about it. And we think there's something to really look forward to in West Virginia. Kentucky also passed a new program. Indiana passed an ESA program. Missouri is a state that also is new to the kind of the school choice landscape, and they enacted their first private school choice program. Ohio established a new tax credit scholarship program, as well as expanded their existing voucher programs. So there was a lot of activity, particularly in the springtime from March through the end of June, in terms of these new enactments of programs and policies that'll be now goes into the implementation phase. And so they'll be implemented in the next year or two.
As you were talking, I was just thinking about, speaking of programs and how we know that the pandemic has caused a lot of disturbances in education, but it has also birthed new ideas in education as well. And so, I wanted to just ask, how has innovation and entrepreneurship actually influenced education to kind of shift because, as humans, we're able to adapt to the circumstances that we are presented. And, in education, we've seen a lot about and heard a lot about things like learning pods and hybrid schooling and parent engagement and organization. And so we've seen teachers not only, work in the school systems, but they were able to take their expertise out of the classroom. And I just wanted to ask you, what are some things that you think that has helped from the pandemic as I guess you could say, blessing in disguise, that actually benefited students in education?
Yeah, no, that's a great observation and really interesting, timely questions that I think we'll be asking and exploring on the research side, but for months and probably years to come. So there have been a few major, I'd say at least a few major developments in terms of, on looking at the surveys that we've conducted and also others have been conducting, parents have been expressing a lot more support and preference for flexibility in terms of how they are educating their kids. And so what we have seen in our polling is that parents are very open to having their children learn at home one or more days a week. That's implied kind of an implied hybrid schooling. So they're fine with their child going to the school building a couple of days or more per week, but also maybe being at home too, or elsewhere to learn. And so that kind of this question about place and where that learning happens is now very fluid, and particularly in minds of parents. And we've also seen that among teachers too, where teachers have expressed similarly that they are open to educating, teaching, instructing students outside of a traditional conventional school building, public or private. And so there seems to be this preference and appetite for a different way of schooling. And then at the same time, we've seen on the entrepreneurship side, we see organizations and networks like Prenda, which is an Arizona-based network of micro schools that started a few years ago. And in their first year, I believe they had less than 10 students who were part of their micro school. And now they have several thousand and hundreds of micro schools that are throughout Arizona. And they've even expanded in other states in Colorado through the pandemic. And so these are very small schools that have some sort of blended or mixed type of mode of learning, whether it's either at home or with a group of other students elsewhere in another building or at a school, physical school. And so this is really just, I feel like the beginnings of this kind of entrepreneurship movement. And it's going to be really fascinating to see how Prenda and organizations like Prenda expand and move, assuming that these preferences that are being expressed by families, by parents, and by teachers continue even beyond the pandemic. And that's something that we're closely watching at EdChoice to see if these kind of opinions persist past the pandemic. And so the micro schooling appears to be taking off. Another example for your listeners that if they're interested is to look at the North Las Vegas Academy, which is a micro schooling academy that launched last school year. And that was really a response to parents not being served well by their local schools and wanting to have a little bit more control over how their kids are learning and where the kids are learning. And that's a distinguishing feature that, of these micro schooling efforts, learning pods, which you mentioned efforts, there's more control and direction by parents or by teachers, as opposed to some far off kind of central administration somewhere. And so that North Las Vegas Academy is another good example. And they've just recently reported that they've been able to catch up some of the learning that may have been lost last year in this last semester. And so that's another example. And learning pods, we've been asking about learning pods in our polling, and we've seen that anywhere from about a third to a half of parents are either said they were participating or seeking out a learning pod, and that was last school year. And we asked them we also asked them how much would they pay for a learning pod, and that's ebbed and flowed a little bit in terms of the amount, but roughly speaking, about parents would say they would pay about $500 per month per child for them to participate in a learning pod. And then the interesting thing about pods that I don't think is getting enough attention in the media is that these pods are not replacement. Generally, these pods aren't replacing schools; they're supplementing or complementing schools. And so that parents are using these learning pods as a way to help support their kids' learning that they may or may not be getting in a traditional school environment. And so what we see is that, and it's been very stable while we've been asking this question, is about 3/4 of parents say they're supplementing their children's educations with pods. They're not replacing. About a quarter say that they are replacing entirely the traditional school environment with a learning pod, but most are saying that they're supplementing. So that's something that'll be interesting to follow too. And Schoolhouse is an organization that's really been an amplifier and a help to parents and these learning pods as an online platform, and to kind of help them access different curricula and other types of instructional materials, instructors as well, to zoom in perhaps. And so Schoolhouse has been a really great connector for a lot of these folks who are doing learning pods. And so that might be of interest. And then the other kind of, I'd say, adaptation, I mean, it's something that's been around for forever, is tutoring. But I think that, tutoring's having a moment now where people realize that it really has a special value now more than ever, and maybe has a new role moving forward for, sustaining educational progress of students and helping, these students who may not be served well or effectively by their own schools. Again, public or private sector doesn't really matter, but tutoring, that's something that folks at the Annenberg Institute at Brown University, they just launched a national student support accelerator. And that's supposed to be a new organization that's really going to explore the potential for implementing high impact tutoring during the school day. And so it's focused really on tutoring in the school environment. But in addition to that, though, what we see in our polling is that parents are interested in tutoring, period, but they're also really interested in tutoring for their children and seeking it out even after school, like for after school hours. And so and we ask teachers if they're willing, to what extent they're willing or like looking for those tutoring opportunities. And we see that a significant proportion, close to half of teachers say that they are either tutoring students right now, or they would consider tutoring in the future. And then we ask also what parents would pay for tutoring and what teachers would pay for tutoring, to just give an impression of what's possible, and to inform that too, to the degree we hope that it can be informative for folks, parents, teachers, and even organizations who want to, start up or expand tutoring, learning pods, microschooling. So I think it's a really exciting time, and there's just a lot out there for parents and teachers to learn about that have really just started to develop in the last year.
I like how you were talking about the learning loss that, everyone's been speaking about, just because it's kind of like the elephant in the room. We've had a crazy year last year, and, we're kind of trying to play catch up with, the students that may have not, learned enough. And then the students that were kind of bored and they knew it already, then you have the group of students in the middle that they're not so bad, but they're probably not that good, as what they could have been as far as academics. And so with most schools reopening in this fall for the fall semester, I like how you mentioned, there's many possibilities. And so for the parents that may be listening to this podcast, what are some ways that they can, some steps that they can take in looking into learning pods and hybrid schooling and just other school choices that may not be completely public school, like, having their kids enroll back into public school just because of the shift, or it could be for health reasons, or even, if they want to look for tutoring, in their own community. what are some steps that they can take to be comfortable with their decision, because it's kind of different from, well, let's just say the norm is to send your child to public schooling. It hasn't really been that questionable until, COVID kind of hit, where we have students that are on, online virtually learning. And so I guess the question is, how do parents, feel comfortable with their decision on exploring other ways of studying?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you asked this question, because in our surveys, for a long time, in our polling that goes back some years, we've been asking a question about parents and their preferences. So what type of school would they choose for their child in order to obtain the best education for her or him? And what we see consistently, and I'm being very general about it, but that roughly about a third would say a public district school, about a third would say a private school, and then maybe 1 out of 10 homeschooling, and 1 out of 10 would say public charter school. And then there's some that also say they don't know, which we get that a lot too, and it's understandable. But when you compare that range, it looks very different than what we see in the real world. With, like you said, most parents are sending their children to public district schools. So about 80% 80% of students around the country are attending district schools, and then about another 10 to 12% in private schools, and then another 5% charter, and the rest in homeschooling. And so there's something out there that is constraining parents, or like holding parents back. But I do, like you said, I think it's really a great observation. It's like, I think the pandemic has, opened up possibilities, and a lot of maybe, just question. I mean, I think it's giving, I'm speaking as a parent. We have 2 daughters, 4th and 6th grade. And we've gone through the remote schooling at different times, and hybrid, a couple of days at school, a few days at home. And I think, it's all been a learning experience for all the parents. And now we understand like what's involved. And I think we're also just understanding, like, we're all in this together. And I'm not trying to be, overly just like all join hands, but I really think that it's like, this is a shared experience among parents, and we understand that, hey, you do what is right for your child, and it's, and I think, and I hope that there's just like, less judgment, or like less, suspicion or whatever of other people's choices. And I mean, just in conversations with, friends, and even through work with meeting other parents and educators. And I think it's just like, we're all in this together. We got to do what's best for our kids. And there are a lot of places that we can learn about this. And our organization is one where you can learn about private school choice programs, but then there are also other organizations. The National Alliance for Public Charter Schools is a wonderful organization. They have tons of information about charter schools in states and where they're located. And Great Schools is another online platform, which is really helpful to find where schools are, on maps, and public, private. And there are lots of different nonprofit, state, local nonprofit organizations that I think have, those resources for parents, and, to learn more about what they, on the private school side, what private school choice programs are available, what private schools are available. Now with education savings accounts, we have other education providers that are not schools, but also those who are providing, who have the online platforms to promote learning, and to connect parents maybe with curriculum. K-12 now, I believe they changed their name to Stride, and they have K-12 curriculum available to homeschoolers and for folks who are educating their children at home. And so there's and the Homeschool Legal Defense Association is a national homeschooling organization that has lots of information about homeschooling, and homeschooling has gotten a lot of attention in the last year. We haven't talked about that as much, but we've seen in our polling that by and large parents are much more favorable towards homeschooling than they were before the pandemic. And that's grown. I mean, it's kind of ebbed and flowed a little bit, but it's definitely, they're much more likely to be positive about homeschooling than they are to have a negative kind of opinion. And we've seen the Census Bureau, they have a great survey that they've been conducting periodically that has shown this, it documented a big shift of students this past school year from public district schooling to homeschooling. And so their last estimate was about 10 or 11% of the children in the US last year were fully homeschooled at home, not enrolled in a public or private school. So, and that's almost 3 times what the rate was before the pandemic. And so I think there's just a lot of, we're still in the middle of this. I mean, the pandemic and also just I think us parents and also educators, like working our way, understanding what's possible. But I think we're more confident about taking responsibility for our children's education. And we have a lot more resources now, either through public policy or from other types of nonprofit organizations who are great connectors to information to really empower parents to help educate their children.
Wow. Well, as we just wrap up this podcast, I just wanted to ask just one more question for the parent audience. I know we've talked a lot about K through 12 education and different types of schooling that parents could consider. And I know you've kind of mentioned a couple of websites or a couple of programs and organizations that parents could look up to receive more information. But I kind of wanted to focus this question on polling and surveys. Some people are better at visually seeing, comparison and charts. And some parents, they need to know, the good from the bad and the percentages, not just from hearing it, but actually seeing it for themselves. And so if you could just give the parents and anyone else, even teachers and students or organizations, websites or places that they can go to actually look at this data for themselves to, know how to better decide which way they would like to send their own children.
Yeah, sure. So we've just released a couple of our polling reports in the last couple of weeks. So this past week, we just released our quarterly teachers survey. So all these the polling that I've been talking about that we are involved in with Morning Consult and that we produce and report out every month, that can be found at edchoice.morningconsultintelligence.com, which is not the easiest URL to listen to or remember, but it's edchoice.morningconsultintelligence.com. And there you can find all the reports from the last year, the questionnaires verbatim, so you can see the interviews that these folks are filling out online. And just lots of information. And I'm always happy to answer any questions for anybody who might be interested in the surveys and polling that we do or other research too. We definitely want to be an open door to folks. And my email is just paul@edchoice.org. And that domain, edchoice.org, is the domain for our organization. And you can learn a lot about different private school choice programs, but also just information about K-12 education in your state on our website. We just launched a new website a few weeks ago. And so we really hope that can be a resource to your listeners as well. And then there are other organizations that have been conducting polling and surveys too that have been great. I mentioned the Census Bureau. They've been releasing survey data on about a biweekly to monthly basis for some time during the pandemic. There's an organization called EdNext it's a journal, but it also has a website, and they have their own polling that they do. Last year, they like us, they did a couple waves of their surveys. National Parents Union is that's an organization. I should have mentioned them before, but that might be of interest to particularly the parents of your listeners out there, where NPU, National Parents Union, they have been around for a few years, but they really have come to the fore as a chief advocate, leading advocate for parents when it comes to educational issues. And they have been doing their own polling with Echelon Insights, which is a polling firm, and they've been doing their own monthly polling. some questions overlap with the ones we ask, but then they also ask some other ones. So I'd definitely encourage folks to check out NPU's monthly polling, and that's available on their website. RAND Corporation has been surveying educators and school leaders periodically throughout the pandemic. The American Enterprise Institute is another think tank based in DC. They have been doing great work surveying school district leaders about what they were doing in the pandemic. And that was really mostly last spring and summer. And then they have also been doing a survey of websites, and they've been going to the school district websites to see what kind of plans are in place for remote or with a mode of learning. So whether it's virtual, hybrid, or fully in person. And so they've been a great resource. Burbio, Burbio, they also do some online research and surveying of district and school websites to have a better understanding of how students are learning, whether it's in person or virtually. And the last one I'd mention is the Center for Reinventing Public Education out of the University of Washington. They have been doing a great job also following what public school districts and public charter schools have been doing in terms of the kinds of modes of learning, but also policies, just different types of policies around the pandemic. So they've been tracking just research throughout the pandemic. They've been a great aggregator and resource of different types of research around K-12 education. So I'd encourage folks to check out CRPE's website as well. So hopefully those can be some resources to your listeners. And again, I'm always happy to talk to anyone who might have questions or have ideas for our polling and suggestions, because first and foremost, EdChoice really wants to be a resource for parents and organizations who are really on the front lines of promoting and advancing opportunities for families.
Well, thank you so much for that. Thank you for all of the resources that you have given, and thank you for everything that you've said and just explained further about, just the different types of schooling, and the polling and the surveys is definitely value added. And I just want to say thank you. It was a pleasure having you as our special guest on today's episode.
You have just completed the most recent episode of the EdYOUcate podcast. Thank you for listening to the most fired up educational podcast out. Tune in every first Wednesday of each month at 5 p.m. during the 2021 through 2022 academic